My name is Betty Richardson. I'm 78 years old, and I've never been more mentally sharp in my life. But 3 weeks ago, my son Richard convinced the staff at Sunset Valley Care Facility that I had severe dementia and needed immediate placement for my own safety. The truth? I was perfectly healthy, living independently in my own home, managing my own finances, and driving my own car. But Richard needed access to my $400,000 in savings to cover his gambling debts, and the mother with dementia was much easier to control than one who could think clearly. "Mrs. Richardson, you need to take your medication," the nurse said this morning, holding out pills I didn't recognize. "I don't take any medication," I replied, "and I don't have dementia. My son lied to you." "That's what they all say, honey," she replied with a condescending smile. "Your son loves you and wants what's best." That's when I realized I had to escape this place and expose Richard's lies before he succeeded in stealing everything I'd worked 70 years to build. If you've ever been gaslit by your own family and had your sanity questioned by people who should protect you, stay with me. Let me tell you who I really am before I tell you what my son did to me. My name is Betty Richardson. I'm 78 years old, and until 3 weeks ago, I was living independently in the same house I'd owned for 45 years. I'm a retired high school principal, a widow of 12 years, and the mother of 2 adult children who I thought loved and respected me. My son Richard is 52 years old, divorced, and has struggled with gambling addiction for most of his adult life. My daughter Susan lives in Oregon with her family and visits twice a year. Richard lives about 30 minutes away and had been my primary local contact since my husband died. For most of my widowhood, our relationship was normal and loving. Richard would visit weekly, help with household repairs, and include me in family gatherings with his teenage daughter Emma. I was proud of the man I thought he had become after his divorce, and I appreciated having family nearby as I aged. The problems started about 2 years ago when Richard's gambling addiction, which I thought he had overcome, resurfaced with devastating consequences. He had been betting on sports through online platforms, and what started as small wagers had escalated into massive losses that threatened his financial stability. At first, he hid the extent of his problem from me. He would ask for small loans, $500 here, $1,000 there, always with plausible explanations about car repairs, Emma's school expenses, or temporary cash flow problems at his job as a sales manager. I was happy to help. I had been careful with money throughout my life, and my husband's life insurance, combined with my teacher's pension and our paid-off house, had left me financially comfortable. Helping my son during difficult times felt like the right thing to do. But the requests became more frequent and larger. A $5,000 loan to cover property taxes, $3,000 for Emma's summer camp, $2,500 for home repairs that I never saw evidence of. Each time, Richard promised to pay me back, but the money never materialized. I began to suspect that something more serious was happening when Richard started asking me about my financial accounts, my investment portfolio, and my estate planning. "Mom, you should really consider adding me to your bank accounts," he suggested during one visit, "just in case something happens to you and I need to help manage your finances." "I'm managing my finances just fine. I've been balancing checkbooks since before you were born." "But what if you get sick or confused? It would be so much easier if I could help you without having to go through legal processes." The suggestion made me uncomfortable, but I attributed it to genuine concern for my well-being rather than any ulterior motive. The truth about Richard's gambling addiction came out 6 months ago when his ex-wife called me in tears. "Betty, I don't know what to do. Richard owes over $200,000 to various creditors, and some of them are threatening him. He's been using Emma's college fund to pay gambling debts, and now that's gone too." I was shocked. $200,000 in gambling debts was more money than I had ever imagined Richard could lose. The fact that he had stolen his own daughter's college fund was even more devastating. "He's been asking Emma to call you and ask for money," his ex-wife continued. "He's coaching her to say it's for school expenses, but it's really going to pay off his bookies." This revelation explains several recent phone calls from Emma, my granddaughter, asking for help with various expenses that had seemed unusually large for a 16-year-old's needs. I confronted Richard about the gambling debts, and he broke down, admitting the full extent of his problem and begging for my help. "Mom, I'm in real trouble. These aren't just credit card companies. Some of these people are dangerous. If I don't pay them back, I don't know what they'll do to me or Emma." "How much do you need?" I asked, my heart breaking for his situation, despite my anger about the lies. He said $50,000 would buy me some time to figure out a payment plan. "I know it's a lot, but I'm desperate." $50,000 was a significant portion of my savings, but the thought of my son being threatened by dangerous creditors was terrifying. I agreed to help, liquidating one of my CDs to give him the money. But $50,000 wasn't enough. Within 2 months, Richard was back, asking for more money to cover additional debts he had hidden from me. "I thought I told you about all of them," he said when I questioned the new requests, "but there are a few more creditors I forgot to mention." Over the next 4 months, I gave Richard a total of $120,000, nearly a third of my life savings, to help him pay off gambling debts. Each time, he promised it would be the last time, that he was getting help for his addiction, that he would pay me back. But instead of getting better, Richard's behavior became more erratic and demanding. He started visiting more frequently, not to spend time with me, but to pressure me for additional financial help. "Mom, you're sitting on all this money while your son is in crisis. What's the point of having savings if you won't use them to help your family?" The pressure was relentless, and I began to feel like an ATM rather than a mother. Richard would arrive at my house with new sob stories, new threats from creditors, new emergencies that required immediate financial intervention. 3 months ago, Richard suggested that I should consider moving to a senior living facility. "Mom, you're getting older, and I worry about you living alone in this big house. What if you fall and no one finds you for days?" "I'm perfectly fine living alone. I have neighbors who check on me, and I'm in excellent health." "But wouldn't it be nice to have people around, activities to participate in, meals prepared for you?" I suspected that Richard's sudden concern about my living situation was more motivated by his desire to access my home equity than by genuine worry about my safety. 2 months ago, Richard escalated his campaign to convince me that I was becoming forgetful and confused. "Mom, you told me the same story 3 times during my last visit," he would say, even when I knew I hadn't repeated myself. "You forgot that we had plans to have lunch today," he would claim, even when we had made no such plans. "You seem confused about what day it is," he would observe, even when I was perfectly oriented to time and place. At first, I dismissed these comments as Richard's attempt to manipulate me into giving him more money. But as they became more frequent and specific, I began to doubt my own memory and cognitive abilities. The final betrayal came 3 weeks ago, when Richard arrived at my house with a woman he introduced as a social worker. "Mrs. Richardson, your son is concerned about your safety and well-being. He's reported that you've been having memory problems and confusion that might make it unsafe for you to live alone." "I don't have memory problems," I protested. "I'm perfectly fine." "That's what many people with early dementia believe," she replied. "The condition affects insight and judgment, so patients often don't recognize their own symptoms." The conversation that followed was surreal. Richard provided examples of my supposed confusion and memory loss, most of which were complete fabrications. The social worker took notes and nodded sympathetically, clearly believing his version of events over my protests. "I think it would be best if we arranged for a temporary placement in a care facility," she concluded, "just until we can do a proper assessment of your cognitive abilities." "I don't consent to any placement," I said firmly. "I'm competent to make my own decisions." "Mom, you're not thinking clearly. This is for your own safety." Within hours, I found myself being transported to Sunset Valley Care Facility, a locked dementia unit, where I was told I would be staying temporarily while my condition was evaluated. The woman who had been living independently and managing her own affairs was suddenly a prisoner in a facility for people with severe cognitive impairment, and her own son was the one who had put her there. The first week at Sunset Valley Care Facility was the most disorienting and humiliating experience of my 78 years. I was placed in a locked unit with 20 other residents, most of whom had severe dementia and required constant supervision. The staff treated me like I was cognitively impaired, speaking to me in the condescending tone reserved for children or confused elderly people. "Good morning, Betty," the nurse would say each day, speaking slowly and loudly as if I were deaf or mentally deficient. "I'm feeling like I don't belong here. I don't have dementia, and I need to speak with someone about getting discharged." "That's what they all say, honey. Your son loves you and wants what's best for you." The daily routine was designed for people with severe cognitive impairment. We were awakened at 6 a.m., given medications, which I refused to take, fed breakfast at 7 a.m., and then subjected to infantizing activities like coloring books, simple puzzles, and sing-alongs of children's songs. "Betty, you need to participate in activities," the activities director would say when I refused to color pictures of flowers or sing Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. "I was a high school principal for 30 years, I replied. "I think I'm beyond coloring books." "Agitation is common in dementia patients," she would note in my chart. "Patient shows resistance to appropriate activities." The most frustrating aspect was that my protests and demonstration of cognitive competence were interpreted as symptoms of my supposed dementia. When I recited poetry I had memorized in college, they said I was living in the past. When I solved complex math problems in my head, they said I was showing preserved skills in some areas. When I demanded to speak with a lawyer, they said I was paranoid and combative. Everything I did to prove my mental competence was twisted into evidence of my mental decline. The other residents were heartbreaking reminders of what Richard was claiming I had become. There was Eleanor, who spent her days calling for her mother who had died 40 years ago. There was Frank, who tried to go to work every morning and became agitated when staff prevented him from leaving. There was Margaret, who didn't recognize her own children when they visited. These were people who genuinely needed the care and protection the facility provided. I was a fraud in their midst, a competent person who had been imprisoned by lies and manipulation. The worst part was the medication regime. The staff insisted that I take multiple psychiatric medications that had been prescribed by the facility's doctor based on Richard's reports of my behavior. "These will help with your agitation and confusion," the nurse explained, holding out pills I didn't recognize. "I'm not agitated or confused," I said. "I'm angry about being held here against my will." "Anger is a symptom of dementia," she replied. "These medications will help you feel calmer." I refused to take the medications, which led to them being noted as non-compliant and resistant to treatment. The staff began discussing the possibility of forcing me to take the medications if my behavior didn't improve. The isolation was crushing. I was allowed one phone call per day, which was monitored by staff. When I tried to call my daughter Susan in Oregon to explain what was happening, Richard had already contacted her with his version of events. "Mom, Richard told me about your diagnosis," Susan said when I finally reached her. "I'm so sorry. I had no idea your memory problems had gotten so bad." "I don't have memory problems," I protested. "Richard is lying. He's put me in this place so he can access my finances." "Mom, denial is common with dementia," she said gently. "Richard showed me examples of your confusion, and the social worker confirmed that you need care." "What examples?" I demanded. "You forgot conversations you had with him. You got lost driving to the grocery store. You left the stove on and nearly caused a fire." Every single example was a lie, but Susan believed Richard's version of events over my protests. The son who had been stealing my money had successfully convinced my daughter that I was mentally incompetent. "I'm going to fly out next month to visit you," Susan said. "We'll figure out the best long-term care options." "I don't need long-term care," I said desperately. "I need someone to believe that I'm telling the truth." But the call ended with Susan promising to support whatever was best for my condition, which meant supporting Richard's plan to keep me locked away. The financial implications of my imprisonment became clear during my second week at the facility. Richard visited with papers for me to sign, claiming they were routine documents related to my care. "Mom, we need to make sure your bills are being paid while you're here," he said, presenting me with forms that would give him power of attorney over my finances. "I can pay my own bills," I said, refusing to sign. "You're not thinking clearly," he replied. "The facility costs $8,000 per month, and your other expenses are piling up. Someone needs to manage your money." $8,000 per month. Nearly $100,000 a year for care I didn't need in a facility where I was being held against my will? I realized that Richard's plan wasn't just to steal my savings. It was to bankrupt me entirely while keeping me locked away and unable to stop him. "I'm not signing anything," I said firmly. "The social worker says you might not be competent to make financial decisions," Richard threatened. "We can have you declared incompetent and get guardianship if necessary." The threat was clear: sign over control of my finances voluntarily, or have it taken away through legal proceedings where my supposed dementia would be used as evidence of my incompetence. That night, lying in the narrow bed in my shared room with my roommate with actual dementia calling out for her deceased husband, I realized that I was facing a sophisticated form of elder abuse that could result in the loss of everything I had worked for throughout my life. Richard had created a perfect trap. He had convinced medical professionals that I had dementia, isolated me from family and friends who might advocate for me, and placed me in a facility where my protests were interpreted as symptoms of mental illness. If I continued to resist, I would be labeled as combative and paranoid, possibly leading to forced medication that would actually impair my cognitive abilities. If I complied with the treatment plan, I would be validating the false diagnosis and enabling Richard's theft of my assets. But I had one advantage that Richard hadn't counted on. I was still completely mentally competent, and I had spent 30 years as a high school principal dealing with manipulative teenagers who thought they could outsmart me. The woman who had been tricked into a dementia facility was about to show her son that she was much smarter than he had given her credit for. On my 15th day at Sunset Valley Care Facility, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to stop fighting the system from within and start building a case from the outside. But first, I had to escape. The decision came to me during the morning cognitive stimulation session, where I was being asked to identify pictures of common objects, as if I were a toddler learning vocabulary. "What is this, Betty?" the therapist asked, holding up a picture of an apple. "It's evidence of elder abuse," I replied, causing her to make another note about my inappropriate responses and paranoid ideation. I realized that every day I spent in this facility, every session I attended, every medication I refused, was creating a documented trail that supported Richard's false narrative about my mental state. The longer I stayed, the more evidence would accumulate that I was indeed a confused elderly woman who needed institutional care. I had to get out, and I had to do it in a way that would expose Richard's lies and protect other elderly people from similar abuse. The escape plan I developed was simple, but required careful timing. I had observed that the facility's security was focused on preventing residents from wandering out accidentally, not on stopping someone who was deliberately trying to leave. The doors were locked with keypads, but I had memorized the code by watching staff enter it dozens of times. More importantly, I had identified a window of opportunity during the shift change at 3 p.m., when there was a brief period of confusion as the day staff briefed the evening staff about each resident's status. I also needed help from the outside, which meant convincing someone that I was telling the truth about my situation. The only person I could think of who might believe me was my neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, who had lived next door to me for 20 years and knew me well enough to recognize that I was mentally competent. During my monitored phone call that day, I managed to reach Mrs. Patterson and have a conversation that sounded innocent to the staff member listening, but conveyed my real situation to someone who knew me. "Mrs. Patterson, this is Betty Richardson. I'm calling from Sunset Valley Care Facility." "Betty! I was wondering where you'd gone. Richard told me you were visiting family." "I'm not visiting family," I said carefully. "I'm being held here because Richard told them I have dementia. But you know me. Do I sound like I have dementia?" There was a pause as Mrs. Patterson processed what I was saying. "You sound exactly like yourself, sharp as a tack, just like always," she said slowly. "I need help," I said. "Can you call my lawyer, James Morrison, and tell him what's happening? Tell him I need him to come here immediately." "Of course, dear. This sounds terrible." "And Mrs. Patterson, don't tell Richard that you've spoken with me. I think he's been lying to everyone about my condition." The phone call was shortchanged by the staff member, who noted that I had been making concerning statements about family members and recommended that my phone privileges be restricted. But the seed was planted. Mrs. Patterson knew me well enough to recognize that I was completely lucid, and she had the contact information for my lawyer. The escape itself was almost anticlimactic. At 3:05 p.m., during the shift change chaos, I simply walked to the exit door, entered the code I had memorized, and left the building. I was wearing the clothes I had arrived in, which the staff had returned to me that morning for a family meeting that had been canceled. I walked 6 blocks to a gas station and called a taxi, giving the driver my home address. The whole escape took less than 30 minutes, and I was sitting in my own living room by 4 p.m. The house felt like a sanctuary after 2 weeks of institutional living. Everything was exactly as I had left it. My books, my photographs, my comfortable furniture arranged the way I liked it. I was home, and I was free. But I knew that Richard would discover my escape within hours and would likely try to have me returned to the facility. I needed to move quickly to protect myself and build a case against him. The first call I made was to my lawyer, James Morrison, who had been trying to reach me for days after Mrs. Patterson contacted him. "Betty, thank God you're safe," he said when I reached him. "Mrs. Patterson told me what was happening, and I've been trying to get access to you at the facility." "They wouldn't let you see me?" "They said you were too confused to make decisions about legal representation and that your son had medical power of attorney. I was preparing to file an emergency petition when you escaped." James came to my house within an hour, and I spent the evening documenting everything that had happened: Richard's gambling debts, the financial manipulation, the false reports to social services, the involuntary commitment to the dementia facility. "This is a clear case of elder abuse," James said after reviewing my account. "Financial exploitation, false imprisonment, and fraud." We need to act quickly before Richard tries to have you returned to the facility. What can we do? First, we're going to get a restraining order preventing Richard from making any medical or financial decisions on your behalf. Then we're going to file criminal charges for elder abuse and fraud. And we're going to demand an independent cognitive assessment to prove that you're mentally competent. The cognitive assessment was scheduled for the next morning with a geriatric psychiatrist who specialized in dementia evaluations. Dr. Sarah Chen spent 3 hours testing my memory, reasoning abilities, and cognitive function. Mrs. Richardson, I can find no evidence of cognitive impairment. Your test scores are well within the normal range for someone your age, and in many areas they're above average. You are clearly competent to make your own medical and financial decisions. The restraining order was granted that afternoon, preventing Richard from having any contact with me or access to my finances. The criminal charges were filed the following day, including elder abuse, fraud, and false imprisonment. But the most satisfying moment came when I called Sunset Valley Care Facility to inform them that I had been illegally committed based on false information. Mrs. Richardson, you can't just leave the facility. You need medical clearance and a discharge plan. I was never legally committed, I replied. I was brought there based on fraudulent reports from my son, who was trying to gain access to my finances. You've been holding a competent person against her will. But your son provided documentation of your cognitive decline. My son lied, I interrupted. I have a psychiatric evaluation proving that I'm mentally competent, and I'm filing a complaint with the state licensing board about your facility's failure to properly assess patients before admission. The silence on the other end of the phone was telling. The facility realized they had been duped by Richard's lies and were now facing potential liability for holding a competent person against her will. 3 days after my escape, Richard was arrested at his workplace on charges of elder abuse, fraud, and attempted theft. The local newspaper covered the story, and I received calls from other elderly people who suspected they were being financially abused by family members. The decision to escape the facility and fight back had been terrifying, but it had also been necessary. I had learned that sometimes you have to take dramatic action to protect yourself from people who are supposed to love you, even when those people are your own children. The woman who had been imprisoned in a dementia facility was now free, vindicated, and determined to make sure that other elderly people wouldn't face the same abuse. 6 months after escaping from Sunset Valley Care Facility and having Richard arrested for elder abuse, I was sitting in the conference room of the district attorney's office, preparing to testify in the criminal case that would determine whether my son would go to prison for what he had done to me. The months since my escape had been a whirlwind of legal proceedings, media attention, and personal rebuilding. The story of the elderly woman who escaped from a nursing home and exposed her son's elaborate fraud had captured public attention and sparked conversations about elder abuse that were long overdue. Mrs. Richardson, are you ready to proceed with your testimony? Asked Assistant District Attorney Maria Santos, who had been assigned to prosecute Richard's case. I've been ready for months, I replied. I want to make sure that what happened to me doesn't happen to other elderly people. The criminal case against Richard was solid. In addition to my testimony, prosecutors had evidence of his gambling debts, the forged documents he had used to have me committed, and the financial transactions he had attempted while I was imprisoned at the facility. But more importantly, they had the testimony of Dr. Sarah Chen, the geriatric psychiatrist who had evaluated me and found no evidence of cognitive impairment. Mrs. Richardson's cognitive abilities are not only normal for her age, they're exceptional, Dr. Chen testified. She scored in the 95th percentile on memory tests and showed no signs of confusion, disorientation, or impaired judgment. The idea that she has dementia is not just wrong, it's absurd. The facility's records also supported my case. The staff notes show that I had consistently demonstrated normal cognitive function, had refused medications appropriately, and had made rational complaints about my situation. The only evidence of dementia was Richard's initial reports, which had never been independently verified. Richard's defense attorney tried to argue that his client had genuinely believed I was developing dementia and had acted out of concern for my safety. But the evidence of his gambling debts and financial desperation made it clear that his motives were financial rather than protective. The trial lasted 3 days, and the jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before finding Richard guilty on all charges: elder abuse, fraud, attempted theft, and false imprisonment. He was sentenced to 3 years in prison and ordered to pay restitution for the costs of my facility stay and legal expenses. This case represents a particularly egregious example of elder abuse, the judge said during sentencing. The defendant exploited his position as his mother's trusted family member to commit fraud and theft, and then compounded his crimes by having her falsely imprisoned when she refused to cooperate with his scheme. The civil lawsuit I filed against Richard and Sunset Valley Care Facility was settled out of court for a substantial amount that I used to establish a foundation focused on preventing elder abuse and protecting seniors' rights. But the most meaningful outcome of the legal proceedings was the changes they prompted in how elderly people are evaluated for nursing home placement. The state implemented new regulations requiring independent psychiatric evaluations before anyone could be involuntarily committed to a dementia facility, and facilities were required to conduct their own assessments rather than relying solely on family reports. Mrs. Richardson's cognitive abilities are not only normal for her age, they're exceptional, Maria Santos told me after the trial concluded. The new regulations will make it much harder for family members to manipulate the system. My personal life had also been transformed by the experience. The media attention surrounding the case had connected me with other elderly people who had faced similar abuse, and I had become an advocate for seniors' rights and elder abuse prevention. I was invited to speak at conferences, testify before legislative committees, and consult with law enforcement agencies about recognizing and investigating elder abuse cases. The expertise I had gained from my own victimization was helping protect other vulnerable seniors. Your story is educating healthcare professionals about the signs of financial exploitation and the importance of independent assessment, Dr. Patricia Williams, a geriatrician who had invited me to speak at a medical conference about elder abuse, said. The relationship with my daughter Susan had been repaired and strengthened by the crisis. She had flown out immediately after learning the truth about what Richard had done to me, and she was horrified by how completely she had been deceived by his lies. Mom, I'm so sorry I didn't believe you. Richard was so convincing and I trusted him because he was family. He fooled a lot of people, I replied. That's what made his scheme so dangerous. Susan had helped me implement new safeguards to protect my finances and my autonomy as I aged. We established a system of regular check-ins, created legal documents that would prevent anyone from making medical decisions for me without my consent, and developed a network of friends and neighbors who could verify my well-being. I never want you to feel isolated or vulnerable again, Susan said. We're going to make sure you have multiple people looking out for you. The financial recovery had been easier than I had expected. The restitution from Richard, combined with the settlement from the facility, had more than compensated for the money he had stolen and the costs of his fraudulent scheme. I was actually in better financial shape than I had been before the crisis began. More importantly, I had learned to protect my assets from future exploitation. I worked with a financial advisor who specialized in elder financial security, implementing safeguards that would make it impossible for anyone to access my accounts without my explicit consent. The key is maintaining control while also having appropriate backup plans. You want to be protected from exploitation, but you also want to ensure that legitimate help is available if you ever need it, my advisor explained. I had also reconnected with old friends and made new ones through my advocacy work. The isolation that Richard had tried to impose on me had been replaced by a rich network of relationships with people who valued my independence and respected my autonomy. My neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, who had been instrumental in my escape, had become one of my closest friends. "You're an inspiration," she told me during one of our weekly coffee meetings. "You showed that it's never too late to fight back against people who try to take advantage of you." The most unexpected development was romantic. I had met Harold, a 74-year-old widower, at one of the elder abuse prevention conferences where I was speaking. He had attended because his own elderly mother had been financially exploited by a caregiver, and he was interested in learning how to protect other seniors. "Your story gave me hope that justice is possible," he told me after my presentation. "My mother was too ashamed to report what happened to her, but seeing your courage inspired me to help other families." Our relationship had developed slowly, built on mutual values, independence, dignity, and the importance of protecting vulnerable people. Harold understood that I had fought hard for my autonomy and would never try to control or manipulate me. "You've taught me that love should empower people, not control them. You've shown me what it looks like to build a relationship based on respect rather than need." The contrast with my relationship with Richard couldn't have been starker. Where Richard tried to manipulate and control me for his own benefit, Harold celebrated my strength and independence. Where Richard saw me as a resource to be exploited, Harold saw me as a partner to be cherished. A year after my escape from the nursing home, I was invited to testify before a congressional committee that was considering federal legislation to strengthen protections against elder abuse. My story had become part of a national conversation about the rights of elderly people and the need for better safeguards against family exploitation. "Mrs. Richardson represents the best possible outcome for an elder abuse case," the committee chair said during the hearing. "She fought back, exposed the abuse, and has used her experience to help protect other seniors." The woman who had been imprisoned in a nursing home based on lies was now testifying before Congress about the need to protect elderly people's rights and dignity. The experience that had nearly destroyed me had become the foundation for work that was helping thousands of other seniors. I had rebuilt my life from scratch, but what I had built was stronger, more meaningful, and more impactful than anything I had lost. The new beginning I had created was more meaningful and impactful than anything I had lost, and I was excited about the work that still lay ahead. 2 years escaping from Sunset Valley Care Facility, I stood at the podium of the National Conference on Elder Rights, delivering the keynote address to an audience of 800 social workers, attorneys, healthcare professionals, and advocates. The woman who had been falsely imprisoned for having dementia was now recognized as one of the leading voices in the fight against elder abuse. 2 years ago, I was locked in a dementia facility because my son wanted to steal my life savings, I told the audience. Today, I'm standing here as proof that elderly people can fight back, that justice is possible, and that we must never accept abuse simply because it comes from family members. The applause was sustained and emotional.
In the audience, I could see faces of people who had heard similar stories, who had worked with elderly victims of abuse, who understood the courage it took to speak out against family members who were supposed to protect and love you. My advocacy work had grown far beyond anything I could have imagined when I first escaped from the facility. The Betty Richardson Foundation for Elder Protection now operated in 15 states, providing legal assistance, financial counseling, and emotional support to elderly people who were being abused by family members. The foundation had helped over 500 seniors escape abusive situations, recover stolen assets, and rebuild their lives with dignity and independence. We had also lobbied for legislative changes that made it harder for family members to exploit elderly relatives and easier for victims to seek justice. Your foundation has become the gold standard for elder abuse prevention, said Dr. Margaret Foster, the conference organizer. The comprehensive approach you've developed, combining legal advocacy, financial protection, and emotional support, is being replicated across the country. The book I had written about my experience, Imprisoned by Lies: How I Escaped Elder Abuse and Found My Voice, had become a bestseller and was being used in social work programs, law schools, and medical schools to educate professionals about the realities of family-perpetrated elder abuse. Your book opened my eyes to how sophisticated these schemes can be, one reader wrote to me. I'm a social worker, and I realized I had been too trusting of family members' reports about their elderly relatives. Your story taught me to always verify information independently. The media attention had been overwhelming, but ultimately beneficial. My story had been featured in documentaries, news programs, and magazine articles that reached millions of people with the message that elder abuse was a serious crime that could happen to anyone. More importantly, the publicity had encouraged other elderly victims to come forward. I received hundreds of letters from seniors who had been financially exploited, emotionally abused, or physically mistreated by family members, many of whom had been too ashamed or afraid to seek help before reading my story. I thought I was the only one whose children were stealing from me, one woman wrote. Your story gave me the courage to call the police and press charges. My son is now in prison, and I've recovered most of my money. My personal life had flourished in ways I never expected. Harold and I had married the previous year in a small ceremony attended by friends, colleagues, and fellow advocates who had become like family to me. Our relationship was everything a partnership should be, built on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine affection. Harold supported my advocacy work while maintaining his own interests and independence, and I encouraged his volunteer work with veterans organizations while pursuing my own mission. You've taught me that love should empower people, not control them, Harold told me during our wedding ceremony. You've shown me what it looks like to build a relationship based on respect rather than need. The contrast with my relationship with Richard couldn't have been starker. Where Richard had tried to manipulate and control me for his own benefit, Harold celebrated my strength and independence. Where Richard had seen me as a resource to be exploited, Harold saw me as a partner to be cherished. The legal aftermath of Richard's crimes had continued to unfold over the past 2 years. He had served 18 months in prison before being released on parole, and he was required to continue paying restitution for the money he had stolen and the costs of his fraudulent scheme. I had heard through mutual acquaintances that he was working in construction and living in a small apartment, struggling to rebuild his life after his conviction. His relationship with Emma had been severely damaged by his actions, and she had chosen to live with her mother rather than maintain contact with him. I felt no satisfaction in his difficulties, but I also felt no obligation to help him. He had made his choices, and he was living with the consequences. My focus was on preventing other elderly people from experiencing what I had endured. The relationship with Susan had grown stronger and more meaningful than it had ever been. She visited regularly, participated in foundation events, and had become an advocate for elder rights in her own community. "You've inspired me to be more aware of how elderly people are treated," she told me during her last visit. "I volunteer at a senior center now, and I watch for signs of abuse or exploitation. Your experience taught me that we all have a responsibility to protect vulnerable people." My direct impact on other people's lives became the most rewarding aspect of my new life. Every week, I received calls from elderly people who were facing abuse, from family members who suspected their relatives were being exploited, and from professionals who needed guidance on handling difficult cases. "Mrs. Richardson, I think my mother-in-law is being financially abused by her son," one caller told me. "She's always been sharp, but suddenly she's confused about money and can't explain where her savings went." "Trust your instincts," I advised. "Financial confusion in a previously competent person is often a sign of exploitation. Contact Adult Protective Services and ask for an investigation." These conversations reminded me daily of why my work mattered. Elder abuse was far more common than most people realize, and victims often suffered in silence because they were ashamed, afraid, or didn't know where to turn for help. I had also become involved in training law enforcement officers, social workers, and healthcare professionals to recognize and respond to elder abuse. The training programs I developed were being used in dozens of states and had helped thousands of professionals better protect elderly people in their communities. "Your training completely changed how I approach cases involving elderly people," one police detective told me after a workshop. "I used to assume that family members were always acting in their relatives' best interests, but now I know to look for signs of exploitation and manipulation." The most meaningful recognition came when I was invited to the White House to participate in a roundtable discussion on elder abuse prevention. The president signed new legislation strengthening federal protections for elderly people, and my story was cited as an example of why these protections were necessary. Mrs. Richardson's experience illustrates the vulnerability of elderly Americans and the need for stronger safeguards against family exploitation, the president said during the signing ceremony. Her courage in speaking out has helped protect countless other seniors from similar abuse. As I look back on the journey from that terrifying morning when I woke up imprisoned in a nursing home to this moment of national recognition, I was amazed at how much my life had changed. The experience that had nearly destroyed me had become the foundation for work that was protecting thousands of other elderly people. The woman who was silenced and imprisoned was now one of the most prominent voices in the fight for elder rights. The victim, who had been told she was confused and incompetent, was now educating professionals and policymakers about the realities of elder abuse. Most importantly, I had learned that it was never too late to fight back, never too late to seek justice, and never too late to turn a terrible experience into something that helped others. The new beginning I had created was more meaningful and impactful than anything I had lost, and I was excited about the work that still lay ahead. 3 years after Richard's arrest and conviction for elder abuse, I was leaving a conference on senior rights in downtown Portland when I encountered him in the hotel lobby. It was the first time I had seen him since the trial, and the meeting was as awkward and emotionally complex as I had expected it would be. He looked older, more worn than I remembered. His clothes were clean but inexpensive, and he had the tired appearance of someone who was working hard and struggling financially. When he saw me, his face went through a series of expressions: surprise, shame, and something that might have been regret. "Mom," he said quietly, approaching me hesitantly, "I didn't expect to see you here." "I was speaking at the Elder Rights Conference," I replied, maintaining a calm but distant demeanor. What brings you to Portland? Construction job. I'm working on a project here for a few weeks. We stood in uncomfortable silence for a moment, both of us aware of the enormous chasm that his actions
had created between us. The last time we had been in the same room, he was being sentenced to prison for trying to steal my life savings and having me falsely imprisoned. "I heard about your foundation," he said finally, "about the work you're doing to help other elderly people. I'm glad you found a way to make something positive out of what happened." "What happened?" I repeated. "You mean what you did to me?" He looked down at his hands. "Yes, what I did to you." It was the first time he had taken direct responsibility for his actions without trying to minimize them or blame his gambling addiction. "I also heard about your book," he continued, "and the speaking engagements, the legislative testimony. You've become famous for fighting elder abuse." "I became an advocate because I experienced elder abuse," I said. "Because my own son tried to steal my life savings and had me locked in a nursing home based on lies." "I know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know what I did was terrible. I think about it every day." "Do you?" I asked. "Do you think about how it felt to wake up in a locked facility being told I had dementia when I was perfectly healthy? Do you think about how it felt to have my own son betray me in the most fundamental way possible?" "Yes," he said, tears forming in his eyes. "I think about all of it. I hate myself for what I did to you." I studied his face, looking for signs of manipulation or self-pity. But what I saw appeared to be genuine remorse and shame. He looked like a man who had been living with the weight of his actions for 3 years. "Why?" I asked. "Why did you do it? I would have helped you with your gambling debts if you had just asked honestly. Why did you have to lie and manipulate and try to have me declared incompetent?" "Because I was desperate and selfish and stupid. Because the gambling addiction had taken over my life completely, and I couldn't think about anything except getting money to pay off my debts. Because I convinced myself that you wouldn't miss the money, that you were old and didn't need it. But having me committed to a nursing home, telling people I had dementia, that went far beyond stealing money." "I know," he said. "I told myself it was temporary, that I would get you out once I had access to your accounts and could pay off the debts. But I realize now that I was planning to keep you there indefinitely. I was going to let you die in that place so I could inherit your money." The admission was shocking in its honesty. I had suspected that Richard's plan involved long-term imprisonment, but hearing him acknowledge it was still devastating. "Do you understand what you almost did to me?" I asked. "You almost stole my entire life, my freedom, my dignity, my autonomy, my financial security, everything." "I understand now," he said. "I didn't then. I was so focused on my own problems that I couldn't see you as a person with rights and feelings. I saw you as an obstacle to getting what I needed." We talked for another 20 minutes, and I was struck by how different Richard seemed from the manipulative, desperate man who had orchestrated my imprisonment 3 years earlier. Prison and the loss of his relationship with his daughter apparently forced him to confront the reality of what he had done. "How is Emma?" I asked. "He won't speak to me," he said, his voice breaking. "She's 18 now, in college, and she wants nothing to do with me. She said what you did to me was unforgivable, and she was right." "She was always a smart girl," I said. "She asked me to tell you that she's sorry," he continued. She said she should have questioned what I was telling her about your condition, should have visited you at the facility to see for herself. I replied, she was 16 and trusted her father. She has nothing to apologize for. She's studying social work now, Richard said. She says she wants to help elderly people who are being abused by their families. She says you inspired her. This information was both heartbreaking and hopeful. Emma had been traumatized by learning the truth about her father's actions, but she was channeling that experience into something positive. I'd like to reconnect with her someday, when she's ready, I said. I think she'd like that too, Richard said. She talks about you sometimes, about the grandmother she remembers before everything went wrong. As our conversation wound down, Richard made a request that surprised me. Mom, I know I have no right to ask this, but would you consider meeting with me again sometime? Not to rebuild our relationship, I know that's probably impossible, but just to talk? I'm in therapy now, trying to understand how I became the kind of person who could do what I did to you. I considered his request carefully. Part of me wanted to say no, to protect myself from any further emotional manipulation, but another part of me recognized that this conversation had been helpful in its own way, providing closure and understanding that I didn't realize I needed. I'm willing to consider it, I said, but any future contact would have to be on my terms, and it would never involve rebuilding the kind of relationship we had before. I understand, he said quickly. I'm not asking for forgiveness or reconciliation. I just think it might help both of us to have honest conversations about what happened and why. I'll think about it, I said. As we prepared to part ways, Richard made a final statement that stayed with me long after our encounter ended. I want you to know that seeing what you've accomplished, how you've turned what I did to you into something that helps other people, it's made me realize how strong and remarkable you are. I always knew you were smart and capable, but I never appreciated how truly extraordinary you are until I saw how you survived what I put you through. I survived because I had to, because the alternative was letting you destroy me completely. I'm glad you didn't let me destroy you. The world is better because you fought back. The encounter left me with mixed emotions. I was glad to see that Richard seemed to have developed genuine remorse for his actions, but I was also reminded of how completely he had betrayed my trust and how close he had come to destroying my life. I was willing to consider limited future contact, but only because I had become strong enough to engage with him without being manipulated or hurt. The woman who had been imprisoned in a nursing home was now secure enough in her own power to face the son who had put her there. The encounter reminded me of how far I had traveled from that terrifying morning when I woke up locked in a dementia facility. I was no longer a victim. I was a survivor who had turned her trauma into a mission to protect others.
5 years after escaping from Sunset Valley Care Facility, I stood in the auditorium of the newly opened Betty Richardson Center for Elder Protection, watching 200 social workers, attorneys, healthcare professionals, and advocates participate in our annual training conference. The center, built with proceeds from my book sales and foundation donations, had become a national model for comprehensive elder abuse prevention and victim services. The irony wasn't lost on me that the center was located just 3 miles from the nursing home where I had been falsely imprisoned. The facility that had once represented my powerlessness was now overshadowed by an institution dedicated to empowering elderly people and protecting their rights. 5 years ago, I was locked in a dementia unit because my son wanted to steal my money. I told the opening session audience. Today, we're gathered in a center that has helped over 2,000 elderly people escape abuse and rebuild their lives. That transformation is possible because we refuse to accept that elder abuse was inevitable or unstoppable. The applause was warm and sustained, but more importantly, I could see hope and determination in the faces of people who were committed to protecting vulnerable seniors. The center had become a beacon for the elder rights movement, and our training programs were being replicated in dozens of states. My personal transformation had been just as dramatic as the institutional changes I had helped create. The woman who had been silenced and imprisoned was now one of the most recognized voices in the fight against elder abuse, and my advocacy work had reached millions of people through media coverage, legislative testimony, and educational programs. Harold and I had celebrated our third wedding anniversary the previous month, and our relationship continued to be a source of joy and partnership. He had become actively involved in the foundation's work, using his background in business to help us develop sustainable funding models and expand our services. "You've built something that will outlast both of us," Harold told me as we toured the center's new legal clinic, which provided free representation to elder abuse victims. "This movement you started is changing how society thinks about aging and family relationships." The legal clinic was one of our most important innovations, providing specialized attorneys who understood the complexities of elder abuse cases and could help victims navigate the legal system. Too many elderly people had been unable to seek justice because they couldn't afford legal representation or didn't know how to access it. "Mrs. Richardson, your center saved my life," one client told me during the conference. "My daughter had been stealing my Social Security checks for 2 years, and I didn't know how to stop her. Your lawyers helped me get my money back and press criminal charges." These success stories reminded me daily of why the work mattered. Elder abuse was still a massive problem affecting millions of seniors, but we were making a difference one case at a time. The relationship with Emma, my granddaughter, had been beautifully restored over the past 2 years. She had graduated from college with a degree in social work and was now working for our foundation, helping elderly people who were facing family financial abuse. "You taught me that family love should protect people, not exploit them," Emma told me during our monthly lunch meeting. "What my father did to you was unforgivable, but watching you turn that experience into something that helps others has shown me what real strength looks like." Emma's involvement in the foundation had been healing for both of us. She brought energy, fresh perspectives, and a deep understanding of how family dynamics could become toxic. Her work with abuse victims was exceptional because she understood both the love that made people vulnerable to family exploitation and the courage required to break free from its influence. "I want to make sure that no other grandmother has to go through what you experienced," she told me. "And I want to honor the strength you showed by fighting back." The relationship with Richard had evolved into something I never expected, a limited but meaningful connection based on honesty and accountability rather than traditional family bonds. We met for coffee every few months, conversations that were difficult but ultimately helpful for both of us. "I've been in therapy for 3 years now," he told me during our most recent meeting. "I'm finally beginning to understand how the gambling addiction warped my thinking and made me capable of doing things I never thought I could do." "Do you think you're a different person now?" I asked. "I think I'm the person I was before the addiction took over, but I also know that I'm capable of terrible things under the right circumstances. That knowledge keeps me vigilant about my recovery." Richard had been sober from gambling for 4 years and was working steadily in construction.
He lived modestly, paid his restitution faithfully, and had volunteered to speak at some of our foundation events about the perspective of family members who had committed elder abuse. I want people to understand how easy it is to rationalize exploiting elderly family members, he told audiences. I convinced myself that my mother wouldn't miss the money, that she was old and didn't need it, that I would pay it back eventually. Those rationalizations made it possible for me to do increasingly terrible things. His willingness to speak publicly about his crimes had been valuable for our educational programs, showing that elder abuse perpetrators weren't monsters, but ordinary people who had made terrible choices. The most meaningful recognition had come when I was invited to deliver the keynote address at the International Conference on Elder Rights. My story had become part of a global conversation about protecting elderly people from family exploitation and ensuring their dignity and autonomy. Mrs. Richardson represents the best possible outcome for an elder abuse case, the conference organizer told the international audience. She not only escaped abuse and sought justice, but she has used her experience to create systemic changes that protect thousands of other elderly people. The speech was simultaneously broadcast to audiences in 12 countries, and I received messages from elderly people around the world who were inspired to seek help for their own situations. Your story gave me courage to report my son for stealing my pension, one woman wrote from Australia. I thought I was alone, but your example showed me that it's never too late to fight back. As I looked around the conference that day, I was struck by how much had changed since that terrifying morning when I woke up imprisoned in a nursing home because my son wanted to steal my life. The woman who had been told she was confused and incompetent was now educating professionals and policymakers about the realities of elder abuse. The victim, who had been silenced and imprisoned, was now one of the most prominent voices in the fight for elder rights. And the grandmother, who had been betrayed by her own son, was now helping thousands of other families navigate similar crises with better outcomes. Most importantly, I had learned that trauma could be transformed into purpose, that betrayal could become the foundation for helping others, and that it was possible to create meaning even from the most devastating experiences. The circle was complete, but it had led to a place of influence and impact that I could never have imagined when I was sleeping on that narrow bed in the dementia facility. The woman who was made powerless had become a force for empowering others. I had come full circle, but to a much better place than where I had started. As I write these final words, 7 years have passed since that terrifying morning when I woke up imprisoned in a nursing home because my son wanted to steal my life savings. I am now 85 years old, and I can say with absolute certainty that escaping from that facility and fighting back against Richard's abuse was the most important decision I made in the final decades of my life. The Betty Richardson Center for Elder Protection has now helped over 5,000 elderly people escape abusive situations, recover stolen assets, and rebuild their lives with dignity and independence. Our programs operate in 25 states, and our training materials are used by professionals in 12 countries. My book has been translated into 8 languages and has sold over 300,000 copies worldwide. I receive letters daily from elderly people who have found the courage to report abuse, from family members who have recognized warning signs in their own relatives, and from professionals who have been inspired to better protect the seniors in their care. Harold and I celebrated our 5th wedding anniversary last month, and our relationship continues to be a source of joy, partnership, and mutual support. We have created a life together that honors both our independence and our commitment to each other, proving that love and companionship can flourish at any age when built on respect and equality. Emma has become the executive director of our foundation, bringing fresh energy and innovative approaches to our work. She has expanded our services to include online support groups, mobile crisis response teams, and prevention programs that educate families about healthy aging relationships. You taught me that strength isn't about avoiding difficult situations. It's about finding meaning and purpose in them, Emma told me during our foundation's recent board meeting. Your example has shaped not just my career, but my understanding of what it means to live with courage and integrity. The relationship with Richard has settled into something I never expected, a limited but honest connection based on accountability and mutual understanding. He continues to pay restitution, participates in our educational programs, and has maintained his recovery from gambling addiction. "I can never undo what I did to you," he told me during our last conversation. "But I can spend the rest of my life making sure other people understand how elder abuse happens and how to prevent it." His willingness to take responsibility and help others has been meaningful, though it will never fully repair the damage his actions caused to our family relationships. To every elderly person who is reading this and recognizing patterns from their own family relationships, I want you to know that you have more power and options than you might realize. You are not obligated to accept abuse from anyone, including your own children. If family members are pressuring you to sign documents you don't understand, if they're isolating you from friends and other relatives, if they're making medical or financial decisions without your consent, if they're telling others that you're confused or incompetent when you know you're not, these are warning signs of elder abuse. You have the right to control your own finances, make your own medical decisions, and live in your own home as long as you're capable of doing so safely. You have the right to seek help, to report abuse, and to fight back against people who are trying to exploit you. To every adult child who might be reading this, I want you to understand that your aging parents are still autonomous individuals with rights, preferences, and dignity that must be respected. They are not children who need to be managed, and they are not resources to be exploited. If you are struggling financially, if you are overwhelmed by caregiving responsibilities, if you are frustrated by your parents' decisions, there are legitimate ways to seek help that don't involve lying, manipulation, or abuse. There are also consequences for elder abuse that can include criminal charges, civil liability, and the permanent destruction of family relationships. The journey from being imprisoned in a nursing home to becoming an advocate for elder rights has been the most meaningful chapter of my life. I have learned that trauma can be transformed into purpose, that betrayal can become the foundation for helping others, and that it is possible to create profound meaning from even the most devastating experiences. I have also learned that fighting back against abuse is not just about seeking justice for yourself. It's about protecting other vulnerable people who might face similar exploitation. Every elderly person who reports abuse, every family member who refuses to participate in exploitation, every professional who takes elder abuse seriously is helping to create a world where aging people are treated with the dignity and respect they deserve. The nursing home where I was falsely imprisoned has since been closed due to regulatory violations that were discovered during the investigation of my case. The building now houses a community center that provides services to elderly people who want to remain in their own homes. The social worker who participated in Richard's scheme lost her license and was prosecuted for her role in my false imprisonment. The new regulations that were implemented because of my case have prevented hundreds of other elderly people from being involuntarily committed based on family lies. If my story has inspired you to examine your own family relationships, to seek help if you are being abused, or to better protect the elderly people in your life, then the humiliation and terror I experienced has served a purpose beyond my own growth and healing. Your dignity matters. Your autonomy matters. Your right to control your own life matters. And it is never too late to fight back against people who are trying to take those things away from you, even when those people are your own family members. The woman who was once locked in a nursing home based on lies is now sleeping peacefully in her own bed, surrounded by people who would never question her competence or try to control her life. The victim, who was told she was confused and helpless, is now a recognized expert whose work protects thousands of other elderly people. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for believing that elderly people deserve dignity, respect, and protection from abuse. And thank you for understanding that it is never too late to fight back, seek justice, and turn your worst experiences into your greatest contributions. Now go protect yourself, protect the elderly people you love, and remember that age brings wisdom and strength that should be celebrated, not exploited. You are never too old to fight back. You are never too vulnerable to seek help, and you are never too powerless to make a difference in the world.